Boldwood presents A Cornish Summer's Kiss, written by Jo Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Maybe it had been a mistake to rent Myrtle Cottage. Even getting there was suddenly terrifying. It was just 4 walls, but it held so many memories of a time when life was good. Back then, Lexie had often willed something to happen, something to shake things up. Be careful what you wish for, they said. How true that had turned out to be. The tide was closing in, and any minute now, the stretch of beach that provided the only access to the cottage would disappear beneath the waves. Lexie eased the car off the concrete ramp and onto the sand. She was used to sitting bumper to bumper in traffic, a city driver, perfectly capable of racing for the last parking space and leaning heavily on the horn if someone cut her up. But this was different. Finn had always driven when they were down here, and somehow the twisting Cornish roads were making her more nervous than London ever had. Holding her breath as the tyres touched the sand, she half expected them to start spinning, leaving her hopelessly stranded at the edge of the water. Only the car didn't stop. It glided effortlessly across the beach, as though there'd been no change in the surface at all. Okay, Albie, we're going to make it. She reached out a hand, and a wet brown nose gave her a reassuring nudge. We'll be all right here, just the 2 of us, won't we? Another nudge from the Labrador, curled up on the passenger seat beside her, was all the reassurance she needed. As she brought the last bag in from the car, a shadow moved at the corner of Lexie's eye, and for a moment she could have sworn it was him, Finn, standing there in the room, laughing at their good fortune that the cottage should have become unexpectedly free, and for 2 whole months at that. It was just a trick of the light, of course, not something she could reach out and touch. Finn was gone, and, even 2 years in, it still twisted her insides every time she forced herself to admit it. I don't suppose the bride thought it was good luck. Lexie spoke aloud, in part to Albie, who briefly acknowledged her with a raise of his soft golden head before going back to sniffing the unfamiliar skirting board, and in part to the empty space where her husband's presence seemed to hang. Just imagine being in her shoes, jilted a fortnight before the wedding, and a 6-week honeymoon going to waste. It was what the agent from the holiday company had told her when she'd inquired about the cottage on a whim one wet Wednesday afternoon, when the longing to be somewhere she and Finn had spent so much time alone together had almost overwhelmed her. Poor girl. The woman from Cornish Gems, whose name was Elsa, had confided over the phone. Must be the worst thing that can happen to a woman, being jilted, don't you think? Lexie had barely resisted the urge to put the woman straight, to tell her there were far worse things that could happen than narrowly escaping a marriage to someone who clearly didn't love you anyway. But she didn't. She'd discovered in the time since Finn had been gone that most people didn't want to hear what you really had to say, even when they seemed to be asking. Sounds terrible. Lexie had given the expected reply instead, before moving the conversation on. Did you say it's available for 6 weeks? Well, they're both teachers, you see. Elsa was getting into her stride now, as if regaling a plot from a TV soap. She had it all planned, a romantic summer in Cornwall, and in Port Cara of all places. There's always a chance of bumping into a royal down there these days, you know. But she's going to the Canaries with her bridesmaids instead, and if I can rent it out again, she won't lose the hefty deposit she's paid. I'm sure it'll be a huge weight off her mind. I'll take the whole 6 weeks. The words had come out of Lexie's mouth almost as if someone else had spoken them. She hadn't planned on going away for anything like as long as that. Although what was stopping her? She'd sold the restaurant, and the one thing that didn't keep her awake at night was worrying about money. Finn had seen to that. That's amazing! The excitement in Elsa's voice went flat as quickly as it had arrived. Although you do realise it's completely cut off to vehicles at high tide. All the other cottages in Port Cara rent out with even advertising them because it became such a celebrity hotspot, but Myrtle Cottage... I've stayed there before. Lexie crossed the fingers on her left hand as she spoke, praying that Elsa wouldn't demand as much of her life story as she clearly had the jilted bride's. Well, that's fantastic then, and it's free the middle 2 weeks of September at the moment, straight after your stay, if you wanted to make it a full 2 months. In for a penny. The brittle laugh caught in Lexie's throat. She reeled off her credit card details before she could change her mind. Elsa hadn't questioned her further. She was just relieved, it seemed, that the poor jilted bride wouldn't suffer any more. Some people had all the luck. Elliot loved the early evening during the summer months, especially when it coincided with high tide and the tourists had cleared the beach. It was as if he owned the whole world, looking out to sea from the top of the cliff face. He'd finished with the guests for the day, done more than his fair share of coaxing and cajoling nervous townies to do something adventurous, to take advantage of the activities they'd paid a high price for, but which, more often than not, terrified them in practice. Now it was his turn for a bit of adventure. The cliffs on this part of the headland were too sheer for any of his guests to attempt, even those who were on a returned visit and had long since caught the adrenaline bug. The rocks beneath the cliff face at Dagger's Head rose up from the water like the jagged teeth of a giant, waiting to impale their victim. Further to the left were a series of rocky outcrops, inaccessible on foot, as they were now interspersed with narrow gaps on the old coastal path that seemed to erode further with every turn of the tide. Only an Olympic long jumper could navigate the track now, and even then, they'd risk plunging onto the rocks below. It was what Elliot liked best about the climb down the rock face and along the old coastal path, before he made his way back up the cliff further along using grappling irons. The absolute certainty that he wouldn't be disturbed. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy company, but, after spending all day being sociable, solitude definitely had its appeal. When he saw her, he almost lost his footing. He was so shocked at the sight of her navigating the crumbling pathway that, had he been the type to believe in all that, he might have thought she'd emerged from the sea itself. With her long blonde hair falling in soft waves below her shoulders, there was definitely something of the mermaid about her. Still, the fact that she was wearing jeans and appeared to be chasing a sandy-coloured Labrador along the path put an end to that particular illusion. The reality was that she was in danger of slipping, and there was nowhere to go but down, onto rocks that would cut her to ribbons, and a sea that was far crueler than it looked, even on a warm summer's evening. A light breeze carried her shout up to Elliot, who was already moving as swiftly as he could towards her. She must have been calling the dog, Alfie or Albie, he couldn't quite make it out. The animal would be much more sure-footed than her, though, and she was taking a stupid risk running to try and catch it. He looked down just in time to see the dog leap over a gap in the old coastal path, its front paws landing squarely on the other side, but its back legs falling short for a moment and scrabbling against the loose surface beneath. Elliot held his breath, but kept moving towards the mystery woman all the time. No matter how ridiculous it was, he had a horrible premonition she was going to try to follow the dog across. Her voice was clearer now. The Labrador's name was definitely Albie, and she was almost screaming at it, her distress undeniable. For a few more seconds, the dog's back legs scrabbled desperately against the unstable surface, but somehow it managed to secure enough momentum to safely get all 4 paws onto the path itself. Elliot finally released his breath and tried calling out to the woman below, to warn her not to follow the dog, whatever she did. He shouted, his voice bouncing off the rock face. But she didn't even look up, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks beneath her clearly drowning him out. She was calling Albie to come back and across the gap in the pathway to her, and as he got closer still, he could make out her face, pale with terror. He knew what she was going to do, and he was powerless to stop it. She wouldn't respond to his shouts or wait for him to get there and help, because she had no idea he was on his way. The dog, on the other side of the gap, gingerly approached the edge he'd just scrabbled over, looked down and turned round again, whining loudly so that Elliot could hear, even from 30 feet or so away. He was so close, she must be able to hear him now. He shouted again, just a simple but meaningful "No!" this time. But still she didn't look up. The dog clearly wasn't willing to come back across the gap, and Elliot tried desperately to get to the woman before she did something really stupid. It was as if they were both moving in slow motion. Him descending down the last 20 feet or so of the rock towards the old coastal path, and her stepping off the pathway to try and breach the gap to the dog. He didn't take his eyes off her, convinced that if he held her in his gaze, he could keep her safe until he got there, and he almost lost his own footing because of it. She stepped off. When he was so close, it felt as though he could almost have reached out and stopped her, but he was still about 10 feet away. He heard the scream, close enough now to see the fear flicker in her eyes. He was sure she was going to disappear into the gap and that he'd have to watch her fall, live with that on his conscience forever. But somehow she managed to grab hold of something, an old tree root or maybe a large tuft of reed, although how long it would hold her weight was anyone's guess. "Don't move, not even to look up at me. It might be enough to snap whatever it is you're holding on to." He was just above her now, on the rock face. He might have enjoyed the adrenaline surge of the fast-paced free climb down the cliff in other circumstances. The sort of risk his old friends would insist he only took because he missed the thrill of the chase since quitting London in a highly pressured job, which showed just how little they really knew him. Not today, though. Putting his own life in danger was one thing. He was an expert, and it was always a carefully measured risk, just enough to make things interesting. Watching someone else do it, and totally recklessly too, was anything but fun. "I don't think I can hold on anymore." Her voice was small, as if even talking was an effort. "You can do it. Just a few more seconds. Don't talk, though. Just hold on." Taking a grappling iron out of his rucksack, he secured it as swiftly as he could, trying to keep calm as he threaded the climbing rope through it, able now to make out the panicked breathing of the woman just below him and the whining of the dog on the ledge to his left. Securing the rope around his waist, he reached down, grabbing her wrist. "You're going to need to let go of whatever you're holding on to, and trust me." "I'm scared." "I know, but I promise you're going to be okay. I've got you now. What's your name?" Lexie Turner." "Okay, Lexie, we're going to do this. You can trust me. There's no way I'll let anything happen to you." He'd keep hold of her or die trying. Slowly, she uncurled her fingers from what he could see now was a thick clump of reed roots. Someone must have been watching out for her, for that to hold her, and for Elliot to be in the right place at just the moment she decided to do something as crazy as she had. It wasn't her time, and he'd make sure of it. "That's it. Now lift up your left arm too, so I can take hold of your other wrist." Pulling her up towards him was hard, and the muscles in his arms strained against the pressure. But finally they were face to face, the scent of her perfume ridiculously at odds with the seriousness of the situation. He wrapped the rope around her waist. She was going nowhere now. "Thank you." When he looked into her eyes this time, there was something else there, something unreadable. Whatever it was, there was real sadness, and for the first time he wondered if she'd risked her life on purpose. Surely no one would do something that crazy without some sort of death wish. "Is Albie okay?" Her eyes darted towards the dog, flat against the cliff face, still whining. "He's fine. Let me get you onto the safe part of the path first, and then we'll worry about the dog. I'm Elliot, by the way." He laughed then at the absurdity of their introduction, glad to break the tension. The intensity in her eyes when she'd asked about the dog had been too much to take. Lexie had never been so glad to feel the stability of the ground beneath her feet as Elliot manoeuvred them both onto the safe side of the path, which Albie had leapt from. She thanked whatever it was, fate, pure good luck, or something else, that had put him on the cliff face at just the moment she decided to do something so ridiculous. Her decision-making had hardly been rational since she'd lost Finn, and Albie was all that she had left of him. He'd been their baby, whilst they waited until they were ready to have one of their own, never knowing that time would run out first, so she couldn't lose him too. Yet despite the sheer torture of the 2 years since Finn's death, and the times when she'd wished she could join him, dangling over that ledge, she'd been sure of one thing. She wanted to live, even without the husband she'd lost far too soon. "Thank you." The words seemed inadequate for what he'd done, but she couldn't help asking for more. "Albie—" "It's okay. I'm going for him now." Elliot gave her a reassuring smile. his deep brown eyes crinkling slightly in the corners as he did. He made a pretty good hero. He definitely looked the part, and he'd had the strength to haul her up to safety too. She doubted he'd have been able to do it if Finn had been alive. She'd eaten far too well back then, and running a restaurant together had put temptation in her path. But eating, like most things, had lost its appeal without Finn, and now she was far too thin, according to her well-meaning parents. As it turned out, being skinny for once in her life had probably saved her from plunging onto the rocks, although there was no denying it was Elliot who was really responsible for that. "Thanks. I know it's a lot to ask when you've already rescued me, but stupid as it seems, that disobedient dog means the world to me." "It's not stupid at all, trying to leap across a gap that big." Elliot paused and looked into the water below them. "Now that's stupid, although I probably choose a much stronger word than that." Before she had a chance to reply, he began to climb back up the rock face. Crossing the gap, she tried to breach a few feet above where she was standing. He looked like a professional, with all the right gear for climbing, and she knew Albie was in safe hands. Like most Labradors, Albie was friendly and would usually do anything for a treat. But his experience in the last 20 minutes or so had clearly brought out the coward in him, and he almost shrank into the cliffside as Elliot strapped some sort of harness onto him. Barking in protest as his rescuer hoisted him upwards, Albie's legs paddled in thin air like a character from a cartoon. Once Lexie started to laugh, she couldn't stop. Relief, shock, and a whole gamut of emotions, which sat far too close to the surface these days, threatened to overwhelm her. "Are you okay?" Elliot placed a hand on her arm. All she could do was nod through a mix of tears and laughter as he picked up the lead she'd dropped when she tried to follow Albie and clipped it onto the dog's collar before taking off the harness. "I'm not taking any chances with Houdini here." "That's probably a wise move. I think being out of the city for once just went to his head, to both of our heads. I should never have let him off or taken this path. It's just so different from when we were last here." A look of relief swept across his face as she spoke. "I did wonder if you were..." He paused for a second. "Sorry, now I'm the one being stupid. It's not as if you'd take a dog with you if you were planning to jump, is it?" He had a disarming smile, and his accent wasn't typically local, although the even tan and the blonde tips to his otherwise dark hair meant he wouldn't have looked out of place striding into the surf. She shook her head at the thought. Surfing was Finn's first love, and if she wanted to pretend to Elliot that everything was okay, she had to keep thoughts of her husband at least partially at bay. "No, I definitely wasn't planning on it. Not with the price I've paid to rent Myrtle Cottage for the whole summer. It would be a real waste to end it all on day one." She laughed a bit too hard at the feeble joke, but Elliot smiled again, patting Albie's head as he nudged at his rescuer's legs. "It's a quaint little place, a bit lonely perhaps when the tide cuts it off, but it's a honeymooner's paradise." His eyes flickered towards her left hand, where her wedding and engagement rings still sat, allowing her to keep up the pretense that she still had Finn. "I'm not on honeymoon, She'd been about to use the dreaded word, widowed, but she didn't want to see that look on his face, the mixture of pity and embarrassment everyone seemed to get at the mention of it. Being widowed so young somehow made other people really uncomfortable. "It's just me and Albie, that's why I had to rescue him. I'm never lonely with him about." The tears that stung her eyes were unexpected, but Elliot really had no idea what he'd done for her. "I'd say it's nice to meet you, Lexie, but I'm not sure that's appropriate given the circumstances. Are you okay to get back down to the cottage by yourself, or do you want me to walk with you?" "We'll be fine, because of you. I'm sorry to have interrupted your climb, but so thankful to whatever fate it was that put you here tonight. What are the odds of an expert climber being on hand just when you need one?" She laughed again, thankful that he hadn't questioned her further about being on her own. She wasn't sure she was up to explaining what had happened to Finn. "With me, the odds are pretty good around here. I run the Adventure Centre up on the cliff top, and this is the sort of thing I do for relaxation." It was his turn to laugh, in response to the expression she knew must have crossed her face. "It's no problem. Just promise me you won't try anything like that again. If it's been a while since you stayed, the old coastal path has been really damaged over the past year or so, and there's none of it that's really safe anymore." "I promise, But if there's ever anything I can do to pay you back, just say the word." She kissed his cheek, the warmth and slight tang of salt on his skin stirring another memory. "I'm just glad you're both all right. Stay safe, okay? And maybe head up to Dorton's Adventure Centre whilst you're here, so you can learn about the coastal paths that are safe to follow, and what to do when you get into trouble. At least that way I'll be able to sleep at night." "I might just take you up on that." Lexie watched as he raised a hand in response, already heading back up the cliffside. He was definitely a pro. The walk back down to the cottage was blissfully uneventful, and even the irrepressibly excitable Albie was subdued. Despite her assurance to Elliot that she and Albie would never be lonely, the quiet back inside Myrtle Cottage was painful. It was probably just the drama of almost plunging between the cliffs into the sea, but closing her eyes, with Albie's head on her feet as she sunk into an armchair, the usual visions of Finn were interspersed with Elliot's face, and a new emotion bubbled to the surface. Guilt. Chapter 2. The screeching of a seagull woke Lexie just after 8 a.m. It would have seemed absurdly late back in the days when she'd run the restaurant, rising at 5 a.m. and heading to the market at least 3 times a week to pick up fresh produce. Back then, sleeplessness had never been something that had plagued her. The long hours spent on her feet and the frenetic pace of running one of the most successful restaurants in their part of London had been enough to ward off insomnia. There'd always been Finn's solid back to cuddle into, too. A safe haven, even on the occasional nights when she was worried about something stupid, like getting their tax returns in on time. All those sorts of worries seemed so trivial now that Finn was gone. Stretching, Lexie forced herself to throw back the covers. Albie, who'd been lying on a rug by the side of her bed, got to his feet, his thick-set tail thudding against the wall of the bedroom. "Sorry, boy, I bet you're desperate for a walk and your breakfast, aren't you?" He looked up at her, total trust in his eyes. He needed her as much as she needed him. "I'll let you out for a bit and then we can have a proper walk after we've eaten." Was it insane to talk to a dog quite as often as she talked to Albie? It was hard luck if it was. They were a team now. The one solid presence left in her world. "Morning." She'd barely stepped out the door of the cottage with Albie on his lead when another dog walker raised his hand in greeting and called out. She waved and nodded in response, dipping her head before he could strike up a conversation. It was strange how friendly dog walkers were, even in London where people were usually head down and hell-bent on getting to their own destination. It was completely changed when you had a dog with you. She'd had conversations walking Albie on Hampstead Heath, where some of the other dog walkers had revealed more about their personal lives than she knew about some of her closest friends. But Lexie always kept her head down these days. Despite a cloudless sky, the wind was strong enough to whip up the surf, and there were already a few wetsuit-clad surfers heading out with their boards. How long would it take before she stopped expecting one of them to be Finn? "Come on, Alb, let's head into town and see if there's a market on today." She missed so much of our old life, even the mixture of pressure and excitement that came from cooking for a restaurant full of diners with sky-high expectations. It was nothing like the wrenching emptiness of missing Finn, but it had all been tied up with their life together. Coming back to Cornwall was about letting go of the things she'd been clinging to for the 2 years since his death. She hadn't been able to go on holiday or do the job she'd loved for so long without him by her side. She'd barely been able to function at first, and happiness was a memory she couldn't quite conjure up anymore, like chasing a rainbow that just kept moving farther away. There was magic in Portcara, though, and watching Albie bounce along the edge of the shoreline where the dying waves finally broke and turned over, she felt alive. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was the closest she'd felt to it for a long time. Leaving the beach, she was careful to stick to the well-signposted new coastal path after Elliot's warnings from the day before. As a couple about her age walked towards her, stopping to kiss, Lexie caught her breath. Stepping back, the man pushed a strand of hair away from his companion's face. Did they realize how lucky they were in that moment when everything in their world was right? Lexie hadn't, not until it was far too late. They didn't speak as she passed by, not even to offer a good morning, too engrossed in each other to notice the woman with tears in her eyes. As they made their way down to the harbour, Lexie's mood lifted again. The charming, hilly streets of Port Cara, leading them to their destination, were weaving their spell, just as they always had. She had to expect ups and downs, everyone had told her that. But being back in Port Cara made it seem possible that, one day, the ups would finally outweigh the downs again. As she passed the jewellery shop where Finn had bought her some Cornish pearl earrings for the last wedding anniversary they spent together, she gripped Albie's lead all the tighter. It was bittersweet being here without him, but she just had to push through the moments when a memory caught her off guard and left her winded. "Are you in a hurry, my love?" A woman who looked to be in her late 60s stepped out onto the pavement in front of Lexie as she headed past the row of shops housed in the Victorian arches, which had once been home to ship chandlers and supply stores. Most of them were now trendy independent boutiques and bistros. But the shop the woman stood in front of was narrow and only slightly wider than the large wooden door emblazoned with the words, "Trelawney's Fortunes." "I'm not interested, thanks." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you were in a hurry." The woman, who was wearing a dark blue headscarf covered in hundreds of tiny gold stars, smiled at Lexie. She was tempted just to dip her head and rush past, but something stopped her. It wasn't that she found it hard to say no to unwanted sales patters. She was adept at politely refusing the leaflets that were regularly thrust towards her when she walked around London, after all. But the woman had such a kind face, and she reminded Lexie of Finn's grandmother, who died a few months after their wedding, so she couldn't bring herself to just ignore her. "I'm just walking my dog, so I'm not rushing. But I'm sorry, I don't really believe in fortune tellers, and it makes me a bit uncomfortable." "I can understand that. But despite what you say, you seem in a hurry to me, and I just think you should slow down." The woman held out her hand. She had at least 2 rings on every finger and glittery nail polish that caught the sunlight, matching the twinkle in her eyes. "I'll bear that in mind." "Please do, my love. Otherwise you'll miss what's right in front of you." She pressed a card into Lexie's hand as she spoke. "Thank you." Closing her fingers around the card, Lexie wondered how long it would be before she could throw it into a litter bin, out of view of the well-meaning but clearly deranged woman still standing in front of her. "They'd want you to be happy, you know." The woman stepped back, and Lexie's head shot up in response. She was obviously just grasping at straws, like those fake fortune tellers in the expose videos on YouTube did. But she touched a nerve all the same. "Who would?" "The one you're rushing away from. But you do need to slow down, or the thing you'll rush right into won't be right for you." "Okay." Lexie let go of the breath that had caught in her throat. The woman was obviously talking nonsense, guessing that Lexie was on the rebound from a bad relationship and trying to make out she had some sort of psychic power. She had the bad relationship bit wrong for a start. Then there was the idea that she might rush straight into something else. Even 2 years on from Finn's death, that was the last thing on her mind. If the woman had been able to tell her what she should be doing next to fill her days with work again, or whether the thought that had flashed into her head about moving away from London permanently was completely crazy, then maybe Lexie would have been tempted to stop and listen to what she had to say, even if she did think it was all just made-up rubbish. "Take care, my love, and remember not to rush anything. You know where to find me if you want to talk." This time Lexie didn't answer, and she didn't care if the woman saw her when she tossed the card into the nearest litter bin. This was one part of Port Cara she wouldn't be coming back to. The rest of the walk passed without incident, and the familiar streets of Port Cara soon lifted her spirits again. Aside from the unwanted attentions of the fortune teller, it was good to be back. Stopping for breakfast in the little cafe that had always been Finn's favourite, 2 streets away from the harbour, she discovered that the couple who ran it still remembered her name. Albie had even been given his own plate with bacon scraps and a whole sausage. They'd asked where Finn was, which meant explaining the accident again, but when they'd insisted on waiving the bill, she'd almost cried. It was another reminder of why she and Finn had loved Port Cara so much. It had always felt like a place she could call home, if her whole life hadn't been so tied up with living in London. Walking back towards Myrtle Cottage after breakfast, she was just drawing level with one of the wooden jetties that abutted the harbour wall when a boat chugged in to moor. A group of men and women were on board, all of them wearing wetsuits, and there was a big pile of diving equipment on one side of the deck. "Well, I must say, it's a relief to see you sticking to the safety of the harbour this morning. No more cliff jumping for you and Albie." She recognised Elliot's voice even before she looked up. "Doing that once is a mistake anyone could have made. Doing it twice would be foolish." She returned his smile, despite a twinge of annoyance that he'd brought her stupid mistake up again. Although seeing as she and Albie owed him their lives, this was no time to hold a grudge. "Looks like you were out diving early this morning." "The forecast said the wind was going to pick up, so I knew we'd get the best of the weather that way. Some of this lot haven't quite found their sea legs yet, and even in the better weather, the journey back to Port Carroll was a bit rough for one or two of them. Not everyone's an action hero." "Are you making fun of me, Mrs. Turner?" He smiled more broadly this time, revealing perfectly even teeth. The fact that he'd remembered her name pleased her more than it should. He ran adventure holidays for a living, so he was probably used to learning the names of whole groups of people within minutes of meeting them. It didn't mean anything, and she didn't want it to. "I just meant that not everyone has your physical capabilities." Her words were coming out all wrong. Why hadn't she just rushed past the boat instead of stopping to speak to him? He thought she was an idiot, and getting tongue-tied with embarrassment because of it wouldn't help to change his opinion. "Well, I'll take that as a compliment, I think." Elliot grinned again, finding her ability to tie herself up in knots far too amusing for her liking. "How about you? Can I interest you in a diving trip later in the week?" "God, no. I always stuck to dry land when my husband hit the surf. He couldn't even persuade me to try bodyboarding, let alone diving. There's something about the sea that's